Adafina is the most iconic and the dish that is more mentioned in all the Spanish Inquisition trials, because in fact, Adafina was prepared every Friday by the converted Jews in Spain. So it was very easy for the inquisitors, but also for the non-Jewish people to identify Jewish families thanks to their food practices.
Welcome to 18 Jewish Foods, Culture and History in kosher bite-sized portions. This podcast tells the stories of iconic Jewish dishes, shedding light on the people who eat them. Here's your host, Joel Haber.
This episode will be coming out in the middle of a period on the Jewish calendar known as the 3 weeks. These are 3 weeks that fall in the middle of the summer in the Northern Hemisphere that are a period of mourning, a time that we remember various tragedies, but in particular, there are 2 fast days, one at the beginning and one at the end, the 17th day of the Jewish month of Tammuz and the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av. And these are connected with the destruction of the 2 temples. The first temple destroyed in the 6th century BC by the Babylonians, and the second temple destroyed in the 1st century, in the year 70, by the Romans. Now, not all tragedies in Jewish history, but I would say the bulk of them have been the result of anti-Semitism, or to use a more accurate term, Jew hatred. Anti-Semitism is a more modern term, and I want to use the most accurate term. So if I use the term anti-Semitism, I'm referring generally to anti-Jewish sentiment. That is certainly one of the tragic constants throughout Jewish history. And if our food reflects the good things, the triumphs and the celebrations of our history, and even some of the quirks of Jewish character, I would say that it should also reflect the tragedies. And so I wondered if this were true, and I started to look into our food, and I certainly found many connections to anti-Semitism, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. We will be looking both at foods that resulted directly from anti-Semitism, but also foods that allowed us to overcome and even triumph over that anti-Jewish hatred. In addition to the events connected with the destruction of the temples, this period also reflects many other tragic events throughout history, either things that happened exactly on these dates or things that were nearby, off by a day or two, and are commemorated on the 2 fast days. For example, the First Crusade, which had many tragic consequences for Jewish people across Europe, also began around this time. In more modern times, the approval of the final solution during the Holocaust and the deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka both happened on or around Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. But moving back to the medieval period, Jews were expelled from England, the first expulsion of the Jewish people from a country in the year 1290, and that too happened on Tisha B'Av. And in 1492, the expulsion from Spain also occurred just before the 9th day of Av. The main food of this episode is connected with that last event. I'm referring to Adafina. Adafina is a type of Shabbat stew, those foods that I discussed in episode 3, foods that were prepared on Friday and left to cook through the night on Friday night to be eaten as a hot lunch on Saturday. In Spain, as I mentioned in that episode, harissa, which was the original Shabbat stew, developed further by receiving new ingredients. But when we get to the Inquisition, which, by the way, is not synonymous with the expulsion. The Inquisition began earlier than the expulsion. In the Inquisition, Adafina literally became the stew of life and death. The Inquisition, to be clear, was not aimed at Jews, or at least not Jews in name. The Inquisition could not touch a Jew who had not converted to Christianity. Rather, it was aimed at conversos. Conversos is the term for any Jew who had converted to Christianity. Some of those conversos were what we now know, or what we now refer to as crypto-Jews. Jews who had converted to Christianity and observed Christianity outwardly, but secretly still maintained various Jewish practices. And that was what the Inquisition was designed to find. Those crypto-Jews, if they had in fact been found guilty of so-called Judaizing, then they would be put to death. So how would the Inquisition authorities be able to identify crypto-Jews? Well, the most frequent tool was via food habits. As a daily custom, food habits tend to change very slowly. And so many crypto-Jews kept eating foods that they ate when they were fully Jewish. And if they continued to do so, this was something that the inquisitors could point to and say, look, you are still a Jew, and they would be burnt at the stake for this. To put a finer point on it, it was not only what you ate, it was what you ate and when you ate it and what you didn't eat or didn't eat it. If a Jew or a crypto-Jew or a converso was fasting on Yom Kippur, that would be a giveaway that he was a Judaizer. Alternatively, if one was caught eating meat during Lent, then that too would be a giveaway. If a converso refused to eat pork, that could indicate that he might actually, or she might actually, still be secretly Jewish. And more than anything else, eating Adafina on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath, was a dead giveaway. To discuss the role of Adafina in the Inquisition trials, I turned to Helene Jawhara Piner. She is a chef and a food scholar. And in addition to a cookbook that she wrote drawn primarily from her PhD studies on the subject, she also published a scholarly book examining the food of the Jews in medieval Spain. You pointed out in your book, Jews' Food in Spain, that Adafina was probably the most frequently mentioned food in relation with persecution during the Inquisition. Why do you think that was?
Adafina is the most iconic and the dish that is more mentioned in all the Spanish Inquisition trials, because in fact, Adafina was prepared every Friday by the converted Jews in Spain. So it was very easy for the inquisitors, but also for the non-Jewish people, to identify Jewish families thanks to their food practices.
So on that, how well do you think the inquisitors actually knew what Adafina was? Or were they using it just as a collective for any dish that was cooked overnight Friday night?
Yes. In fact, it could be very surprising that if we talk about the knowledge that the inquisitors had concerning the food practices of the Jews, they knew very, very well, but not only concerning Adafina, but also concerning all the Jewish food practices that are related to the kashrut.
At the same time, some of the trial records that you see testimonies where you'll see somebody say, oh, my mistress was making mutton and onions, and to me, that's what I think to be Adafina. Clearly, that's not a complete recipe.
Exactly.
So how does that work?
In fact, what was the more important for the inquisitors and the non-Jewish people was not the kind of food that was used to make the Adafina. The more important to highlight was, in fact, the process of making the food, the dish. The fact that the pot should be baked all night, and that the process had to start on Friday. This was very special. So this was more important than the food for the Adafina.
Now, going into this element of the Inquisition records, you had an interesting sentence in your book, Jews, Food in Spain, where you said, without wishing it or knowing it, the censors of the Inquisition Tribunal, for the first time, carried out an inventory of Jewish culinary practices, which I think is amazing.
Yes.
Nobody had really written down what Jews ate and things like that, which means that the inquisitors were actually starting from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any knowledge on how they even learned all of these practices?
In fact, we have evidences that some of the Christians forced rabbis to learn them about Judaism. So that's why they decided, in fact, that's why they knew a lot concerning Judaism.
And were there not also members of the tribunal who were themselves conversos?
Exactly. And this is also another point that we have to take into account. We do not have to think that all the converso Jews were the same. We have also Jews that really and honestly, officially convert to Christianity. And some of them spied, even if they were all Jewish people, so they were Jews at the first time, they turned their opinion and they started to denounce the Jewish people. So that's why also they knew a lot concerning Judaism, because at the first time they were Jews.
Yeah, so this also relates to another question, which is all of the Jews were kicked out of Spain in 1492, all the Jews who hadn't converted. There were many remaining conversos, and certainly some of them were crypto-Jews, and many may have continued in a lineage of this.
Yeah.
The Inquisition, however, continues for hundreds of years.
Oh, yeah.
So does food itself remain as prominent of an incriminating piece of evidence hundreds of years later, or does that sort of fall aside?
It's not fall aside, but obviously what we have to keep in mind is that the Inquisition burned a lot of people, mainly at the beginning when the court started to process the conversos in 1478 in Seville. So at the first time, obviously we have a lot of evidences concerning converso families that were cooking, making Adafina or huevos geminados or other food that really belongs to the Jewish or the conversos from Spain. But yes, in fact, little by little, in the 17th and 18th century in Spain, obviously there were less Jews in Spain and converso Jews. So we do not have a lot of evidences concerning food practices. This does not mean that Jews, just the converso, stopped eating. This does not mean this. But this means that, in fact, the Inquisition process was less strong. And you're right, just reminding that the Inquisition only stopped in the 19th century in Spain. And even at the beginning of the 20th century in Spain, it was totally forbidden to build a synagogue.
So we see that the Inquisition made a direct anti-Semitic attack on us via our food, Adafina. But there are other examples like this throughout history. One of the most pernicious lies is the blood libel, where Christians or others accused Jews of killing Christian babies. But not just killing them. They accused us of taking the blood from those babies and using it to make matzah and wine. In other places, when the church would aim to despoil the Jewish community, they would prevent Christians from buying Jewish meat or Jewish wine. Again, this is an attack directly via food. Sometimes those attacks might leave an imprint on non-Jewish foods around us. For example, one of the most famous foods throughout Spain is cocido. This is a slow-cooked stew, many different ingredients, including chickpeas, and notably, it has a lot of pork in it. Many, if not most, food scholars who study Spanish food believe that this is the culinary descendant of Adafina. And yet, it was conversos who were genuine conversos who took their Adafina. They're not going to stop making it, but they put a whole bunch of pork into it and said, look, I'm a good Christian. I'm eating pork. Two other examples also connected with the Inquisition. One of them is what is known as agristada. Agristada is a sauce, a thickening agent that Jews in Spain used, mixing lemon juice and egg. And this was a way of thickening a stew that had meat in it without using a dairy product. But those who are familiar with Greek food will say, oh, that's avgolemono, one of the most famous sauces and a soup that often has chicken inside in Greece. And again, It is hard to prove with certainty, but it is believed that it was Sephardic emigres, Sephardic refugees from the expulsion arriving in Greece that brought their agristada with them, and it grew into avgo lemono, which literally translates to egg lemon. And in Portugal, there is a well-known sausage that is known as aljera. It is a white sausage that's made with chicken meat. And the theory here, and it is often referred to in a derogatory way as Murano sausage, the theory is that crypto-Jews who wanted to look as if they were genuine converts would hang this aljera sausage out over the door because the white meat looked very similar to pork meat. And therefore they could say, look, I have a pork sausage hanging there to dry, even though it wasn't actually pork. Now, on a more positive side, food has also been our tool for combating anti-Semitism. I spoke in episode 2 about how matzah has sustained us throughout history, but actually the Seder overall is a way of embodying our heritage in our food and allowing the persistence of Jewish identity in a holiday that actually is commemorating a massive attack on the Jewish people. Sometimes we use food as a humorous coping mechanism, such as with Hamantaschen, as I discussed in episode 4. In Hamantaschen and other Purim pastries, Jews literally or figuratively literally eat Haman, the villain of the Purim story, eat his body parts. And this is a way of us sort of jokingly showing he tried to kill us, but we won, so let's eat. The famous joke about all Jewish holidays. And one of my favorite stories comes from the town of Pitigliano in western Italy that used to have a large Jewish population in it. And when the Jews there were forced into ghettos, the story is that the soldiers would go around with these big long sticks and bang on their doors and say, get out of your house and get into the ghetto. Now, there is a well-known and recognized as Jewish cookie from Pitigliano called Sfarato de Goyim, which means the eviction of the Goyim. And it is shaped like a long stick. But not just that, we fill it with a sweet mixture of fruits and nuts. So this is a way of laughing at the pain that we went through and sweetening it at the same time, a tool for perseverance. But perhaps the best example of how food has allowed us to triumph over anti-Semitism comes from Soviet Russia, or more accurately, the aftermath. In the Soviet era, the Russians wiped out virtually all Jewish cultural identity in the span of really one generation. And yet, there were numerous bizarre food practices that persisted the whole time that Jews in Soviet Russia did without necessarily knowing why they did them. In episode 2, I mentioned the idea of eating matzah without any other context for it. But beyond that, there are numerous Jews who lived under the Soviets who spoke about eating kosher pork. What did that mean? They said, well, it was slaughtered by a Jew. He only knows how. That meant that they knew that there was something bizarre about the idea of eating the pork, even though they did it. And some of them would eat it on separate dishes or only by the window instead of at the table. This indicated to them, yes, we're eating pork, but we know that Jews don't do this the same way, that there's a certain taboo associated with pork still. Others report eating cholent that would cook through the whole night. But they didn't do it for Shabbat. They did it on any day of the week. Why did they leave it cooking through the night? Well, that's just the Jewish way of cooking this dish. Now, why do I say that these were the best example of how food allowed us to triumph over anti-Semitism? Because once the Soviet Union fell, and any Jew who actually had a desire to reconnect with their heritage could look to this food and latch onto it and use it as a window into re-exploring the Jewish traditions and heritage. So yes, food definitely reflects the tragic constant of Jew hatred throughout our history. But also it has been a tool for our perseverance, and it has reflected our fortitude and our vibrancy as a people. Next episode, we will be looking at a beloved Ashkenazi classic, Kugel, and my guest will be the well-known cookbook author, Adina Sussman. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Got any questions or comments? Please feel free to email me at jewishfoodbook@gmail.com. Please listen, like, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and I would truly appreciate it if you'd share this with other Jewish food lovers. The theme music you hear is Adir Hu Revisited by Rebbe Soul. Check him out wherever you stream music. And as always, until next time, I wish you B'tei Avon.